Okay, welcome back everybody. This is lesson number 3 for the week. We're in lesson number 1.3. We're going to be looking at healthy economies. In this section, we're going to be discussing the 3 measurements of an economy's health and also naming and describing the 4 phases of a business cycle. One of the goals of an economy is to be healthy. To have a steadily growth production of goods and services. The 3 measurements used to look at the health of an economy are gross domestic product, or GDP, labor productivity, and inflation and deflation. So let's look at these individually. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the total dollar value of all goods and services produced in an economy in 1 year. That's the key, is 1 year. They look at 1 year at a time. So if GDP increases each year, that's a sign of good economic health. It means that our economy is growing steadily, there's more jobs, and consumers are spending. It's a basic measurement of how the economy is doing. So in order to calculate GDP, they look at 4 measures. So let's look what these are. So the first one is our consumer spending for food, clothing, and housing. Remember, that's a year's. They also look at business spending for buildings, equipment, and supplies. Government spending to pay employees and to buy supplies and other goods and services. And then lastly, they look at the exports of a country minus the imports of the country. So next look at the labor and productivity. It's the measure of the number of items produced per worker. So it's 1 worker. There's a simple math to calculate that. So it's computed by dividing the output, which is the number of units produced by that worker, by the input, or the number of hours used to produce those units. So this is the formula. So, like, for example, if we had a worker that produced 4,000 units, that would be our output. And say they took 80 hours to produce those 4,000. That would be our input. So we would take the 4,000, divide it by the 80 hours, and that would give us a productivity for that worker of 5. Now let's look at inflation and deflation. A sustained increase in the general level of prices for goods and services called inflation. And then the opposite would be deflation, which is a sustained decrease in general level of prices for goods and services. So if we have a steady, moderate increase in prices and wages, that's a sign of a healthy, growing economy. Our prices and wages are increasing. We're doing well. And then vice versa, if it's decreasing, then obviously we're not doing well. Inflation can also be a problem if, for example, if our prices increase too quickly, it can cause wages to not be able to keep up with the raise in prices, so that can become an issue. All right, let's look at the business cycle. Business cycle is the movement of the economy from one condition to another and back again. It has 4 phases. There's prosperity, recession, depression, and recovery. Let's look at these individually here. So prosperity. Prosperity is where the most people who want to work are employed, and businesses are producing goods and services at record numbers. Wages are good. The demand for goods and services are high. Unfortunately, though, prosperity doesn't always go on forever. Our next phase is recession. So recession is the phase where the business cycle is the demand for goods and services are starting to decrease. So therefore, then our production decreases because there's not as much demand, which then creates unemployment to rise. Then our GDP growth begins to slow down. A decrease in the use of economic resources and a lower demand for goods and services signal that this phase of the business cycle. So like I said, if everything's kind of got an effect on each other. So if our demand's going down, our production's slowing down, unemployment is increasing, it's going to cause our GDP growth to slow down. So next, let's look at depression. Depression is a phase of the business cycle marked by a prolonged period of unemployment, weak sales of goods and services, and business failures. So businesses are starting to close. We're not selling goods and services. Our unemployment has been high for quite some time. It causes the GDP to fall rapidly. And then I'm sure most of you in your history books may have read about this. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, the unemployment rate reached 25%. And then our last phase of a business cycle is recovery. Recovery is the phase in which unemployment begins to decrease, demands for goods and services begin to increase, and our GDP begins to rise. So we're kind of coming back out of it. We're heading back towards prosperity, hopefully. Recovery leads to economy into the most welcome business cycle, which is prosperity. All right, that's that section. Continue on. We have one more section in this chapter, and then we will have a test at the end of the week on chapter 1.